I want to teach you guys how to build a mech design from the ground up, and I want to go over guidelines to keep in mind, how to draw 3D shapes that you would need, and more. To define a mech is a giant robot that is piloted by a human. So it's pretty much a vehicle, you know, it's not a character like it would be with like Optimus Prime. He's not a mecha, he's his own character, you know. But a mecha, it's piloted by a human. The first rule I want to talk about is the 70-30 rule. So the 70-30 rule, it's generally like a good ratio to keep in mind when designing anything. So basically, you have 70% of one thing and 30% of the other. So in this case, the 70% I want it to be is human, and then the other 30% would be robot. So this 70% human would basically be from the proportions. Most of its proportions will be human-like, and the other 30% would be the robot part. For example, if I wanted to draw like a proportion of a mecha, let's say this is a normal human, right? Now this would be a good proportion already, but I think it's too human personally. So the 30%, you know, it has to be 30% and not 100% like this. Well, you could make it like super human-like, but it's not interesting, you know? You could make it way more cooler. So for example, maybe the head is like smaller, body's way bigger, you know, the upper body, then maybe the lower body is a bit smaller. But then we keep like the arms like that, and we keep the legs. So this is already like better than before. It's still like vaguely human, you know? Maybe this time, you know, the body is like thinner. Maybe you could exaggerate the waist a little bit, and it has like big limbs. So you could really play with the proportions. Like even though it's human-like, try to add like little twists to it, because you don't have limits to it. So these are just like example proportions here. And then another good example would be the face actually. I feel like this one is a big one. So if you try to draw a mech and it looks something like this, you just put like, you know, like screws and panels on it. I feel like you're kind of missing out if you just make it like a giant human. An interesting thing that you could do is remember the 70-30 rule, right? Instead of keeping it like 90% human-like, maybe you could omit some features. So maybe you could remove like the nose, but keep the mouth, you know, case you want to, and then you could really exaggerate the eyes actually. And then don't just make it like human-like. This is where the other 30% comes from, you know, maybe they look like they're wearing like a helmet or something. So it could be for anything, you know. Doesn't have to be just for, you know, 70% human, 70% or 30% robot. This rule is actually used for designing like buildings too, for like shows and stuff. So like let's say it's 70% modern and like 30% fantasy, you know, something like that. So yeah, keep the 70-30 rule in mind. Very helpful. And now I want to talk about 3D shapes, because this is a really important skill to have. So yeah, it's important to get your 3D shapes right. Let's say I'm drawing this cylinder here. You know, this cylinder could be anything. This cylinder could be like a building. So if you know your 3D shapes well, if you practice it well. So the cylinder could be like a building, or it could be a person. So if you really get a hold of your 3D drawing here, you could really draw anything. This is a really important skill to have, because if you know your 3D shapes, you can break down complicated shapes into simpler shapes. So yeah, if you're having trouble actually with having 3D shapes, like how to draw like a cube from like different angles, you know, I highly suggest like getting clay and then making the shape and then using that as your reference. It's really helpful. Back in the day, that's how I used to practice. I used to make the shapes I wanted to make, and then I would draw it. And then at some point, you know, you just get used to it, and then you could just draw 3D shapes out of your head. And then mobility. I think mobility is a big one to keep in mind when you're designing your mech. So always remember, when we're designing a mech, we are not making a human. So, you know, bodily limitations, like let's say twisting your arm, right? Let's say, you know, you have your palm up, and if you twist it, you know, there's like a limit to it. It's probably like, you can't do like a full 360 with your arm. You probably only rotate it until like right here. It's a limitation. But for robots, you know, it doesn't matter. So maybe you could have like an arm that just like fully rotates 360. And maybe humans are like 270? You know what I mean? You can't twist your arm fully. Remember that. Keep that in mind. This is the one you should take the most time on. And that's because, you know, this is what pretty much decides how you would design it. You would design around the mobility. And then another thing, right? It's not just about, you know, limitless movement. So like, let's say waist bend like this, right? I don't think that's necessary for our mech to have like a waist bend like this. So maybe our mech, it's just the upper torso and then the waist and then the pelvis right here. It doesn't bend, you know, like a human would, but that's okay because I don't feel the need to add it to my mech. Unless it's like really important to you, then maybe you could add like, you know, the classic pattern, a common like design feature to make it flexible. Our mech body may not be able to twist like a human would, but it could do like a full 360 again. You know, it could rotate. So yeah, keep it in mind when you're designing your mech. Mobility is very important. And then another thing, right, is you could get creative with how you do stretches. So like, let's say we're gonna do an arm raise right here. Maybe if a human were to raise his arms, start with a T, and then they'd raise up their arms like that. So maybe for our mech design, what we could do is have the circle and then have like this U shape right here. And then basically this U shape could rotate. So that's like one design I could think of for arm raise. So you could get really creative with it. You can help support us to make free arts education. Become a member on Patreon or YouTube and get special perks like critiques and classes. If you're starting off, a good way to start off is look for reference, but don't look up like super robot reference. It's good to look up, but look up stuff like hinges, like door hinges, any like good mechanisms that move, or maybe buy like an action figure. Another easy way to figure out mobility, how stuff works. Because if you figure out how things move, right, especially for an action figure, you could then look up like other stuff that help out with the process. This is like really advanced, by the way. And let's say like stuff that gets raised uses a piston. You could start experimenting basically. So I say start off simple, you know, like look up good hinges and like stuff that moves and then go advanced, you know. It's always a good way. Start off simple. And since somebody mentioned like, you know, detailing robots is really hard, it's good. It leads up to our next part. Okay, let me show you what greebling is because you probably know what it is. So greebling, you know, this is a normal cube. It's a cube. It does nothing. It just sits there. Right? But if I greeble it, maybe like add an air vent right here, and maybe there's like lights and a panel right there, maybe a few pipes, maybe there's like a deeper part here, maybe there's like a grid design, bunch of screws again, and what else? Maybe some panel lining over here. So basically this is what greebling is. So, you know, it's still a cube, it still does nothing, but it looks cooler. Basically, it's a technique you see a lot in Star Wars. Like for example, the Star Destroyer. You know, if you break down the Star Destroyer without like all its designs, it's pretty much just like this shape. But then if you look at the Star Destroyer, it has all these like unnecessary looking detail. You know, it's like really busy, and it gives off the illusion that it's something like complicated when really it's just the shape. Yeah, so I definitely encourage looking up what greebling is. So that's like the simple gist of it. Artists are often scared of drawing mechs because it seems complicated and intimidating, which they can be. My biggest tip for drawing anything that overwhelms you, whether it's mechs or something else, is to keep it simple and build upon it. By starting off with simple geometric shapes like cylinders, cubes, and spheres, I give myself enough breathing room to think of the overall shape of the mech and how its joints move and function. Once I feel comfortable with that, I then start to work on the fun details like color and aesthetic. If you find it difficult to draw 3D geometric shapes, try practicing from still lifes. Draw a water bottle or a stack of books, then draw them as cylinders and cubes. This helps you understand shapes and forms better. It's also pretty fun telling people that I learned how to draw this mech by drawing mundane objects. By keeping things simple, it becomes easier to tackle, and trust me when I say that you're more capable than you think. Join a virtual art class to learn live from our professional artists. Get creative assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork. Start today and level up your practice. If you learned something new, please like and share this video with a fellow art nerd. If you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe. Here's a couple other videos you could check out next.